everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, what we're going to be doing is talking about how we can interact with a GraphQL server through our client-side application. And specifically for this crash course, our client-side application is going to be a React application. But these same concepts are going to be applicable whether it is a Vue application or an Angular application or any other application. So let's just first talk about how we typically interact with our server if we had a typical REST API. So let's say we had a client and we had a server that is responsible for, getting all of our foods, adding food, and sending food to the client. So what would we have to do in order to get this kind of information from our server? Well, our client is going to have to make some sort of HTTP request. So over here we have an HTTP request. Over here it says my API. So whatever this API is called, each API is going to have a unique URL. And then over here we are appending /foods, meaning that, hey, I want an array of all the food. So the server is going to get this route and it's going to execute some logic. And then at the end of the day, what it's going to do is going to retrieve all of the food, and it's going to go ahead and send it to the client. So it could look something like this. It could look like an array of objects where the object has a name, which is the food itself, hot dog, category, lunch, image, some sort of URL, and then an invented by. Maybe we want that type of information. And it sends that array to the client. And then the client is going to go ahead and just, do whatever it is that it's going to do with it. Maybe it's going to iterate over the array and render it. Now, one thing that I want to note about this approach is the client really has no control about the data that it's going to get back. It has some control. It's saying that, hey, I want to get back an array of foods because we're hitting specifically this route over here. But it really has no control as to, what properties it wants. That's really up to the server in this case. The server is just going to get the data and return the data. So this isn't a great approach for our client because maybe there's different aspects of our application that need to perform this query and get this data, but they need different pieces of, information. For example, maybe a piece of our client, all it needs to do is just render the image of the food as well as the name of the food. Well, in this case, it would be great if I can query the server and just get back an array of objects where I just have the name and I also just have the image, but I don't have the category and I don't have the invented by. But then maybe there's another aspect of our application where I just need the image as well as the category. So, you guys can kind of see what I mean here. With this, what we could possibly do is just create hundreds and hundreds of different routes that kind of accommodate for this, or we can just build a GraphQL server. A GraphQL server is going to allow us to query for exactly what we want. And there's a lot of different benefits, but for this simple crash course, that is all I'm going to leave it at. And instead of showing you guys through a presentation, let's actually go ahead and let's look at how this works. So there's a really cool GraphQL server that was created for us already called the rickandmortyapi.com/GraphQL. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link this in the description below. So over here, what this is a GraphQL playground. So really all this is doing is simulating how we would query for data inside of our real client-side application. So remember, if I wanted to get a list of characters, maybe I wanted to get all of the list of characters from Rick and Morty. In a typical REST application, I would probably make a request like this. So I'd have the API itself, and then I would make /characters. So /characters. And what this would probably do is go ahead and give me a list of all the characters. Now in GraphQL, you don't do it this way. Actually, what you do is you define exactly what it is that you want. So let's go ahead here, and I encourage you to do this with me. First of all, that we have to do is specify that we want to query our data. So we want to do a query. There's different things that we could do. We could do a query. We could also do a mutation. Mutation is changing, updating, adding, changing our data in some way. We can also do a subscription that we won't get into. That's kind of a more advanced and niche concept. So over here, let me just get rid of this if I can. Over here, the first thing that we want to say is we want to query data. Okay, and now what we have to do is define, okay, what do we want to query? And what's great about GraphQL is that it's self-documented. You can actually go to the docs here, and you can see all of the different queries that we can perform. If this is too much for you, do not worry. You guys will understand this is just kind of a quick introduction. So you can see here all of the different queries that you can perform. So let's say we want to get a list of all characters. Well, over here, we're going to say characters. So we're going to say characters. And then we have to define exactly what properties we want. So if you actually click on the characters, you can see here that this has two different fields, info and results. So we're going to say here that we want the results. So to do that, we're going to have to put curly braces. And then here, we're going to say that we want the results. And now going into the results, we can here specify, okay, well, we want the name, we want the image, we want the type, because you can specify whatever it is that we want. So over here, what we can say is, I want the name, maybe I want the image, as well as the ID. And if I were to make this query, you can see here that I get back some data. So you can see here that right here, I get an array where each object has an ID, a name, and an image. Similar to over here, I get an ID, name, and an image. So really, it's kind of, I'm getting back the same kind of data. I'm getting back a JSON object. However, the way that I'm interacting with my server is very different, and it's a lot more flexible. So right now, you can see here that I have an ID, a name, and an image. Well, I can also query if I wanted to. Maybe later on, maybe I can also query for their type, whatever, or maybe their gender, because I don't really understand what type is. So I can go ahead and query for this, and now I get ID, name, image, as well as gender. And that right there is the power of GraphQL. And we're gonna learn exactly not how to implement a GraphQL server. I already have a crash course on this, and I am thinking about making a Udemy course, a very in-depth Udemy course about GraphQL. So I might link that in the description below as well. But right now, we're going to assume that the GraphQL server is already created, and it is already created. We're going to be using this Rick and Morty API. All we're going to do in this crash course is learn how we can perform these types of queries and get data from our React application. So let us get right into it. In this section, what we're going to be doing is learning how we can connect our React application to our GraphQL server. So to do this, of course, what we're going to need to do is create a React application, and I do expect you to, well, know how to do this. If you don't, just open up your terminal and run this command right over here. npx create React app, and then give your React app a name. Then go ahead and open your React app in your favorite code editor. Mine is, well, VS Code. And over here we have just a very boilerplate and simple React application. Again, I do expect you to know React if you want to learn how to connect a React app to a GraphQL server. So I'm not going to be teaching you React. I'm going to be teaching you how we can do the connection. All right, so over here we have our React application, and what we want to eventually do is connect it to that Rick and Morty API. So, let's actually go over here. We want to connect it to this API over here. So this is the route that we want to connect it to. Let me just comment that. This is the route that we want to connect it to. And what's great about GraphQL is there's only one route and one route only. No matter what the data it is that we want, we only have this one route that we connect to. There's only one single endpoint. So how do we connect to this? Well, there's multiple different frameworks that we can use in order to use GraphQL in the client side. There's so many out there, but the premise of them really is the same. And for this crash course, we're going to use Apollo client because I think it is by far one of the more popular ones and the more widely used. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to our terminal, and inside of our React app, we need to do some installations. So we can do npm install, and what we want to do is we want to install at Apollo and then client. And this is a tool that we're going to utilize to connect to our GraphQL server, or well, in this case, somebody else's GraphQL server, which is their Rick and Morty server. So we're going to install this, and then we're also going to install another package called GraphQL, which is needed for, well, interpreting GraphQL queries and mutations. So let's go ahead and let's just install this in our local machine, or not our local machine, inside of our React application. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. But now, once this has finished downloading, what we need to do is, again, we've done the installation, but now we need to connect our React application to our Rick and Morty GraphQL server. So how do we do this? Well, we're going to do this by going over here to our index.js file. Remember, this is the file that contains the root of our application. And we're going to import some things. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to import, and we're going to import something from at Apollo client. Now, what is this thing? Well, we're going to import Apollo client and in-memory cache. So we're going to go ahead and import these two very, very important things. And now what we're going to do is we want to go ahead and create our application, our client. So our client is going to be const client, and then we're going to do a new Apollo client. And then over here, we're going to have to supply it with two parameters, the URI, and the URI in this case is this over here. So we're going to go ahead and supply it with that. And then we're going to also have to supply it with a cache. And this is why we had the in-memory cache. So what's actually great about GraphQL and Apollo is that if we were to query once, what it's going to do is it's going to memorize that query. And if we were to make that same query again, instead of hitting the GraphQL server, it's going to hit the cache. And this is where the in-memory cache comes into place. So over here, this is the client, which is going to have all the information about our GraphQL server. But now we need to connect it to our React application. To do this, we will use another very important component called the Apollo provider. And this is going to be a React component that we're going to wrap our whole application in. So we're going to wrap our application in this, and we're going to supply it with a prop called client. And that is going to be the client that we have created over here. So remember, the client is telling us, and let me put a comma here, the client is telling us that this is the GraphQL endpoint, and thus we want to make queries to this GraphQL endpoint. The Apollo provider, which is wrapping our whole application, is taking that client and thus making that interpretation. And that's really all you need to do in order to connect your React application to your GraphQL server. In this section, what we want to do is create our very first query. And so let's actually talk about what the query is. So what I want to do is I want to display all of the characters inside of Rick and Morty. And so what I want to display is just the image of the character as well as their name. So how is the query going to look like? Well, it's going to look very similar to this, except maybe, well, definitely I do not want the gender. I'll probably still want the ID and the name and the image. So I'm going to go ahead and query for this, and I'm going to get this data back inside of our client application, And then what we're going to be doing is, well, iterating over this array and rendering each card. So let's go ahead and do this right now. And I actually noticed something, and hopefully this isn't, hopefully you didn't try to run your application. This over here should actually be new in memory cache. Apologies for that. So let's go ahead and let's just try to run our application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do yarn start. You can do npm start. I'm going to do yarn start. So I'm going to go here and sure, whatever. Let's go here, and it seems like it's running the application on localhost 3000. So let's go to localhost 3000 and we should see our wonderful application. And let me just minimize this over here. Okay, cool. So we have our wonderful application, and I wonder if you would have gotten an error if this wasn't new. I guess not, or I guess you would have. So hopefully you guys didn't try to run it. Apologies for that. Hopefully you guys caught it. All right, so now what we want to do is, well, we have ran our application. Now what we want to do is we want to make a query. So let's go ahead here and let's create a directory. And this is going to be the pages directory. And in here, I'm going to have a characters list component. So I'm going to have a character list.jsx. I'm going to do RFC for getting a just a quick component up and running. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the index.css, and I'm going to completely remove all the styles. And then I'm going to go to the app.css. So I'm inside of the app.css. I'm going to remove everything, except I'm going to give the app a max width of 70 rems. And then we're going to have a margin of 10 rems and then auto. We're not going to be doing a lot of styling. This isn't going to be the prettiest application. And so over here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to go into our app.js, and then we are going to be removing many of the boilerplate that we have over here. So let's actually go ahead and let's do that right now. So we're going to go here and we're going to remove all of this. And we're going to go ahead and save this. Let's save that as well. And now if I were to make a nice little refresh, you can see we have a very, very empty and boilerplate application. Okay, very, very cool. So now let's go to our character list component. Where is that? Let's actually get rid of this. This is kind of getting annoying. So now what I want to do is that inside of this character list application, I want to query for those characters. And then what I want to do is, well, render those characters. So how do we query for characters? Let me zoom in here. Well, how do we query for anything inside of GraphQL? Well, to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to import a very special hook that we get from Apollo client. And this is the use query hook. The use query hook, a very, very special and important hook that we need to utilize in order to query our data. And you're going to realize how amazing this hook is, and it's going to make your life so much easier. So the way that this hook works is we do const, and then we get back some things that we can destructure. So we get back something. For now, I'm just going to say something. And then we're going to say that this is equal to the use query hook. And then in here we have to specify that GraphQL query. So right in here, we have to specify the GraphQL query that we want to create. So, or we want to execute. So in this case, the GraphQL query is this one over here. So you might be thinking, well, I can just have a string in here and I can add this GraphQL query, or how do I add this GraphQL query is probably what you might be thinking. Well, the way we can add GraphQL queries is by utilizing something called GQL. So GQL. And we also get this from @Apollo client. So outside of the component, what we do is we give our GraphQL query a name. And typically, it's all in capital letters, and it's a snake case as well. So we can say get characters. So this is the name of our GraphQL query. And then we can say this is equal to GQL, and then we have the template literals. So we have two template literals. So this is going to be in the far left, right above the tab bar if you're on Mac. I'm not really sure what it is on Windows, but there's also a tilde sign right next to it. So over here, these are the template literals, and then in here, you can actually paste in your query. Now I get this really cool syntax highlighting because I have installed a GraphQL extension on my Mac that does this syntax highlighting. But if you don't have it, it might just be like a regular string for you. So I highly suggest to install this. So right now, this is our query. And what we can do now is paste that query inside of the use query hook. And now, actually, what we end up getting is, well, okay, what is the something that we get? Well, the something that we get is an object. And so we get this object. So let's actually just change this to object. And we get three main properties. We get object.error, we get object.loading, and then we get object.data. So you might be thinking, well, this might make some sense. So right now, object.error is going to be, well, just an error. So if an error happens, it's going to be populated inside of object.error. So we can actually catch this and do something with our application. Object.loading is a Boolean value. Is our application loading at the moment? Meaning, is it fetching the data? And you know, when we fetch data, there's a period of time where it's not instant. There's a period of time where the application is loading to get our data. So is that true or not? So this can be very useful if you want to display some sort of spinner or whatever. Then object.data is our actual data. So let's actually log all of these. And to kind of simplify it, and this is how it's typically done, let's just destructure out everything. So we want error, we want data, and we want loading. And what I want to do is I want to console.log this. And when you use query, this is going to be called as soon as the component is rendered. So we're going to go here, and we're going to console.log the error, the data, and then the loading status. Let's actually put the data. Here at the very end. And so let's go ahead and let's see the logs. So let's inspect this. And of course, we're not going to see anything because for one, it's very small for you guys. And for two, we haven't rendered this component anywhere. So let's go back into our app.js file. And then in here, we're going to do characters list. I'm going to auto import it. So go ahead and auto import that. And now let's refresh, and you can see here, well, we get some data. So you can see here, error at the moment is undefined because there's no errors. Loading is true. Okay, so this is really great. So it's in the process of fetching our data. So it's telling us loading is true. This might take some time. Maybe you should display some sort of spinner at the moment. And then data is undefined. And then after a while, so after it was able to fetch it, now error is undefined, loading is false, and hopefully this is big enough for you guys. So error is undefined, loading is false, and then we get back some data. So you can see here the data is characters, and then results, and we have this array of results. So now what we can do here is we can actually account for all of this. So let's go here. We're going to say, well, if it's loading, then let's return some sort of spinner. I'm not going to actually return a spinner. I'm just going to be very lazy and just say spinner inside of a div. That's how lazy I am. So now what we can do, if I were to refresh this, you can very faintly see that we have a spinner. Let's actually zoom in here a little bit. Very faintly, you can see here that we have a loading state. Now, obviously, this loading state is very ugly. You can make it as pretty as you want. So over here, we have error or loading, but we should also account for error. So let's over here say maybe an error happened in case an error happened, I want to say something went wrong. You can have a great error response here or nice UI, but for here, who cares? So right now, well, no error is happening, but let's say we messed up our query. So if we mess up our query and we ask for something that doesn't exist in the schema, like let's say instead of saying name, we say NAM, because we're not very smart and we don't know how to spell, you can see here, if I were to refresh, we have a quick little loading state, and then we have something went wrong. So over here, we can actually display an error state. Now, an error state doesn't always have to occur because we made some sort of schema. Sometimes we want to actually throw an error inside of our client if maybe the user did something that they're not really supposed to be doing, or we weren't able to do something inside of our client. So over here, we have this error state. Let's actually fix the query. And now what we want to do is let's go ahead and let's actually render our component. So let's give this a quick class name, and we're going to give this a class name of character list. And in here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say data.characters.results.map, and then we're going to say for each character, what I want to do is I want to return some sort of card component. So we want to return some sort of card component. So over here, I'm wondering, should we create a separate component, or should we just solely rely on, you know what, let's just not create a component. I feel like that would kind of take away from what we're trying to do here. So what I want to do here is let's just create a div. So what we're going to do is we're going to return a div, and then inside of this div, we're going to have an image, and then this image is going to have a source value of character dot image, and we're also going to have an h2 of character dot name. And so now you can see here that we're getting back all of our characters, which is really cool. I really do enjoy this. Now we gave this a class, so let's just quickly fix the styling over here. So let's go here, let's create a character list.css file. And then in here, we're simply just going to display flex list. If you don't know flex, I do have a Flexbox crash course. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do flex wrap, and we're going to say wrap it all. Please wrap it all. And then in here, what we're going to need to do is import character list.css. So now we have this. We can also do something like justify content. So yeah, justify content. We can do space. Let's do space evenly, so we have nice even spacing. Wonderful. So you can see here we are able to actually query this data from our client-side application, which is amazing. You can see here we can have a nice spinner state, and we can fetch our data. So again, I am pretty happy about this, but there's kind of a problem here. What if in our in another part of our application we need to make this exact same query? So it seems kind of redundant the way that we're doing this. We're going to have to create this over here, and then we're going to have to do this, and then we will, and then we're going to have to, of course, do, well, we're going to have to do this regardless. But it's redundant that I have to always create this query and then have this use query hook and import all these things. So how can we fix this? Well, we can actually fix this by putting all this logic inside of its own custom hook, and that is what we will be doing. In this section, what we're going to be doing is creating that query hook that I was talking about. So let's actually do that by creating a hooks directory inside of the source directory. And then in here, we're going to create a use characters.js file. And this is going to be a very simple function. So over here, we're going to have a very simple function called use characters. And we're going to go ahead and export this function out. Now, inside of this function, what we want to do is execute the query that we want. And what is the query that we want? Well, we want this query over here. So let's actually go ahead and let's paste that in there. And let's paste in these imports as well, because we're going to need GQL from Apollo server. And so what this is going to do is we have this query over here. Now what this function is going to do, anytime that we call this function, it is going to make this exact same call over here, the use query call. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to very simply return the error, the data, as well as the loading state. And so now what we can do, and you can see here, this is a very simple thing that we did. Now what we can do is we can just go over here, completely get rid of all of this stuff, and simply just import the use characters hook that we have created. And you can see here it auto imported, and we can just call this hook. So now what we can do is we can say, we want the error, the loading state, as well as the data from the use characters hook, and we want to invoke this use characters hook. And so over here, very, very simple. And if I were to go back to my application, it still works the exact same way. And what's great about this is now we can reuse this hook anywhere we want. So anywhere we want to reuse this hook, we can just go ahead and reuse it. So this is a very common way of fetching data in GraphQL. In this section, what we're going to be doing is figuring out how we can deal with queries that have variables within them. For example, let's say what I want to do is when I click on a specific card over here, I want to be redirected to a new page that shows the image, the name, the gender, as well as all of the episodes that that character has been in. How do we do that? Well, to do that, we're not going to do the characters query. Rather, we're going to do the character query that you see here. And we're going to supply it with an ID. And so if we were to execute this, we get the character with the ID of 4. If I were to change this to 2, you can see here that this changes to the ID of 2. So how do we do this? Well, let's actually go here. And what I want to do is let's create the functionality where when we click on a card, it redirects them to a brand new page. So to do this, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install React Router DOM. So let's do yarn add React Router DOM. You can do npm install React Router DOM, same thing. So let's wait here. Okay, cool. And now what we want to do is we want to get that browser router and wrap it inside of our application. So we can do browser router. You can see here, I got it from browser router. We're going to wrap this. This is just basic React. I do expect you to know this. Sorry if you don't. But yeah, so now we have wrapped our application in browser router. So in here, what we can do is we can have a switch that we get also from React Router. And then inside of this switch, we're going to have our routes. So over here, we're going to have our routes. So we can go ahead and you may also have to install React Router. I'm not sure if React Router DOM comes with this or not, because I already actually pre-installed this. So if you can't get the switch statement, just do npm install React Router. So now we want our route. Let's auto import that in as well. And we're going to say strict exact. And we're going to say that the path. So if we are in the root path, which is just a slash, we want to render the characters list component. So that's the component that we want to render. And so this shouldn't change anything inside of our application, and it doesn't. Now let's also add another route here, and we're going to have, this is going to be anything that is slash and then ID. So this is what we're saying here, any sort of ID. And over here, we're going to render another page, and we're going to call this page, what should we call this page? Well, let's just call this page character.js. Very, very simple page. let's create a component here. And in this page, well, what we're going to do is we're going to render the character, and we're going to call out that query. So in here, let's go and let's just say character. Let's auto import that in. Save that. Now, if you were to go to slash whatever, we should get that page. And just to prove it to you, if I were to save this, we get that. We get this text. All right, awesome. So now what we want to do is we want to make that query. Now we could again make this query inside of this file, but let's actually create a hook for this. We're going to say use character.js. And so let's just copy everything that we have inside. Actually, you know what? Let's just do it from scratch. So the first thing that we need to do is the query. So this is the query that we want to execute. So let's go here and we're going to call this query get character. So we're just getting one character. And we're going to say that this is equal to, and remember how we have it over in the other hook, is equal to GraphQL. So GQL, let's auto import that in. And this is getting it from tags. I want to get it from Apollo client. So let's specify that. GQL from Apollo client. And we want to run this query over here. But right now we're hard coding the ID of 2. So how do we dynamically generate the ID? Well, to do this, inside or right after the query, so right after we have specified that we want to do a query, let's give the query a name. So we're going to call this get characters or get character. And then in here, we're going to specify that this query is going to take in an ID. And to do this, we're going to say $ID, that's the name of the variable. And then we have to define the type of it. Is it a number? Is it a string? Is it a Boolean? In this case, this is a very special type known as the ID type. And we're going to specify it with a bang saying that you absolutely need to provide it in order to run this query. And then this ID, we can inject it right over here into this query. And so now let's actually create the use character hook. And this use character hook is going to take in an ID. And then over here, we're going to get data, error, and then loading. And then we're going to get that from the use query hook. And we're going to say here that we want to run the get characters. But now how do we get this ID inside of this query over here? Well, as the second parameter, this takes in an object of options. And one of the options is the variables object. So over here, we can specify all of the variables inside of an object. In this case, we have the ID. So we can specify this ID and put it in there. And then, so lastly, now what we can do is simply just return data, error, and loading. Very, very simple and easy. So now let's go ahead and let's export this out. And now what we want to do is let's go to our character components. And so over here, all we are going to have to do is just simply execute this component. So in here, what we're going to do is very simply, we're going to do const data loading error, and that's equal to the use character hook that we have created. Again, notice that I auto imported it. Now, of course, we have to provide it with an ID. For now, let's just hard code the ID of 4. We're just going to hard code that in because why not? So let's go ahead and as usual, let's just console.log the error, the loading, and the data. Save that. So now let's go here. And so, okay, so you can see here we have, oh, we got our data right away, it seems. Let's just refresh this here. So, okay, so right now undefined, true, the data is undefined, but now we get our data, and you can see that our data is the character with an ID of 4, and that's because we have 4 here. If I were to change this to 5, you can see here that now our character is the character with an ID of 5, which is Jerry Smith. All right, cool. So now what we can do is we can actually render everything inside of this component. So let's, this is just going to be a little bit of React. This isn't really going to be anything special. Let's actually give this a class name of character. And let's also create a character.css file. Character.css file. And ideally you have these in your own directory, but I kind of forgot about that, so apologies for that. And so in here, we're going to do just a little bit of styling. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna have, let me just check my notes here. I actually do not remember what we have here. So we're gonna have the character and we're gonna display flex here. And we're also gonna have another class over here called character content. We're gonna have this have a margin left of 2 rems. And then lastly, we're gonna also have a character episode. And this is gonna have a margin top of 2 rems. So that's really all we're gonna have. And then in here, we're gonna go ahead and import that CSS file in. So let's have character.css so we can have the styles. And so in here, what we're gonna do is, let's do the whole, you know, if error, then return something went wrong. Because we have to do that, of course. So something went wrong. Of course, you can have better elements in here. If loading, we can have some sort of spinner. And then over here, well, we're gonna have our actual component. So over here, we're gonna have an image. So we're gonna have our image. And then the image is gonna be data.character.image. Let's also give this image a width of 750 pixels as well as a height of 750 pixels as well. And then we're gonna also have a div. And then inside of this div, we're gonna give it that class of character content. Character content. And then in here, we're going to have an h1 that's going to display the character's name. So we can say data.character.name. Let's also display their gender in a p tag. So we can say data.character.gender. Okay, very, very cool. And then we want to display the episodes. And so this is actually a div. And so what we're going to say, or this is a list. So what we're going to have to do is let's create a container that's going to contain all this stuff. So we're going to say character, and then we're going to say episode. And then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over the character.episode.map. And then for each episode, what we're gonna do is return, let's just return a div. We're gonna return a div, and I did this all wrong. No, I did this all wrong. Let's go here. There we go. What we're gonna do is we're gonna return a div. You can add a key here. You should add a key here, but I'm too lazy. We're gonna have episode.name, and then we're gonna do in bold, so let's use a B tag for bold. We're gonna have the episode. Episode.episode. So this is just simple React. And there we go. Let me just zoom out here. You can see that we have Jerry, and then we have, well, all of these episodes here that he has been in. So now if I were to change this to maybe 2, you can see here we have now Morty and all the episodes that he has been in. Now one thing is we want to dynamically generate it. So ideally what we can do actually is we can go to our character list component and we can change this from being a div to being a link tag. So we can say link. And what this can do is it can link to, so this can say to, and it's going to link to whatever the ID is that we get back from the character. So we can say character dot ID. So if I were to save this, now in here, in the actual character, what we need to do is find a way to actually get that ID, and very conveniently, there's something called use param. So we can say over here, const, and then we can get the ID from the use params hook that we can get from React Router. And then in here, we can inject the ID. So in here, we can inject the ID. Let's get rid of that console.log. And so now, something went wrong. Well, the thing that went wrong is, right now I was trying to find an ID with this thing. And actually, this is actually kind of a good example. So something went wrong here. And clearly what went wrong is there's no character with this particular ID. If I were to change this to 3, then it works. But let's actually go back here and let's add a crazy ID. And let's think about how we can actually debug this. To debug this, the best thing to do is to go to your Networks tab over here. So go to your Networks tab and then refresh this and then look for the GraphQL queries. So click on the GraphQL query, go to the header, and then over here you can look at the response. Okay, this one's not that useful. Okay, this one's definitely more useful. So you can see here that, okay, so this is the query that we tried to execute. This is the variable that we have specified. Why is this not working? Well, you can go to preview, and you can actually preview the error over here. So you can see here, we're getting a 404 not found, which means, well, the character is not being found. So it's just throwing an error because the character is not found because there is no character with that particular ID. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that is incredible. In this section, what we're going to be doing is covering lazy queries. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, right now, inside of our application, we are running our query each time our component renders. So we're running it over here. And over here, if we go to the root application, we're going to be running it as soon as it renders. Sometimes what we want to do is run our query after we perform some sort of action. So maybe we want to run a query to fetch some data once we click on a button. Hey, Felix, how's it going, buddy? Let me just calm him down a little bit. He's meowing too much. Are you done meowing? All right, cool. I'm gonna come back. So sometimes what we want to do is, again, run our query right after we perform some sort of action. For example, what we might want to do is run our query if we want to search for a specific name and figure out the location where that individual lives. And we want to run that query when we go ahead and press search. So to do that, we're going to have to use something different than use query, because use query always runs at the very beginning of a component render. So let's actually talk about, well, use lazy query, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to want to run a query where we get the characters, but this time what we want to do is we want to filter them by their name. So we want to filter them by their name. So for now, what we want to do is, let's say I picked Morty Smith. I want to be able to get all of the locations, so results, and then locations that a Morty Smith lives in. If this doesn't make much sense to you, Rick and Morty, there's multiple dimensions. And so Earth is like one dimension, and then there's multiple dimensions. We can have multiple Morty Smiths living in multiple dimensions. So if we were to execute this, you can see here we get 4 Mortys. One that is in Earth replacement dimension, one is in Earth evil Rick target dimension, one in this dimension, and then one in this dimension. So what I want to do is I want to be able to search for a specific character by name and then get all of these locations and render them. So again, we're going to have to use a lazy query for this because this is a query that we want to do once we execute some code or once we perform some sort of action, not when we go ahead and render it. All right, so let's go ahead and let's actually do this. So in here in the pages directory, let's just create a very simple search component. So we're going to say search, and in this very simple search component, all we're going to do is we're going to do RFC to create our component, and all this is going to have is an input. So we're going to have an input that is going to take in the name. So over here, let's actually add a use state here. And we're going to say name, we're going to say set name, we're going to say that's equal to the use state. And initially we're going to have that equal to nothing. So we're going to set the value equal to the name, and we're also going to on change, and then on change we're going to get the e value, and we're going to say set name equal to e.target.value. Very simple here. And we're also going to get a button. So in here we're going to have a nice little button, and inside of this button we're going to say search. Very simple. So let's go into our app.js file. Let's find that in here. And then in here, what I want to do is right after this one, but before this, what I want to have is another route. We're going to do strict exact, and we're going to say path is equal to /search. I'm going to say the component is the search component. So let's do search. Auto import that in. Awesome. So if we were to go here and then we were to go to /search, we should see this very ugly input. And we're not going to style it because you know what? Who cares? So what I want to do is I want to be able to type in Morty Smith and query and get a list of all of his locations. How do we do that? Well, let's first get the query, because this is the query. And for something like use lazy query, we're actually not going to create a hook for this. And there's a very good reason for this. Let me show you why. So we're going to go here, and like usual, we're going to create a query. We're going to name it. We're going to get character locations. We're going to say GQL. Unfortunately, this always imports from GraphQL tags, and I want it from Apollo client. So let's just do add Apollo client GQL. And we're gonna have our query in here. Now over here, we're gonna need a name. So over here, we can just say something like get character name, or sorry, get character locations. That's the name of the query, locations. And then we're gonna have here $name, and then this is going to be of type string. And we're going to have that in here. Okay, so we have our query, which is terrific. So now what we want to do is we want to get use lazy query. So use lazy query. And what this does is it doesn't return an object, it returns an array. So over here, we're going to get back an array. We're going to say use lazy query. Other than getting back an array, all this is going to be the same. We're going to have our query in here, and we're going to have to supply it with the variable. And so the variable in this case is the name, which is in our state. The first element that we get back is a function that we can call when we want to invoke and execute this query. And so we can call this whatever it is that we want. So we can call this whatever it is that we want. I'm going to call this get elements, or sorry, not get elements, get character, or get locations. That's what I'll call it. Get locations. So get locations, and then the second element in this array is that object that has the loading, the error, and the data. So initially, this is not going to exist anywhere because we have to call this. So now what we can do is inside of our inside of our button, we can execute an on click. So we can go ahead and execute an on click, And what this can do is it can execute the get locations, and it can just go ahead and just call that get locations function over here. And what that is going to do is, well, execute this right over here. It's going to execute this query, and it's going to get back the loading, the error, as well as the data. And also another thing that we actually get back here is called. So we actually get back something called called. So let's actually go ahead and let's just log everything. And you can probably imagine what this called is doing. It's basically checking is, hey, did this thing ever get called? So let's go here into the search. And now if I were to log or to inspect the logs, you can see called is false. Undefined data, undefined errors, and then the loading is false. So this is kind of the default behavior. So now let me just go and copy Morty Smith in here. I'm going to go ahead and copy Morty Smith. And then if I were to execute this, you can see here we get true. We get a loading state that is true. And then over here in the other call, now this is true because we called it. Then we get back our data. So you can see here we have gotten back our data after performing some sort of action. So that's pretty much it. That's really all we have to do. And this way of doing things is actually identical when you want to also perform a mutation. I'll talk about mutations very briefly a little bit later because unfortunately the Rick and Morty API only has queries and not mutations, but I will talk about mutations very briefly. But really, if you understand how to do this, you will understand how to do mutations as well. Okay, so now that we got that, let's go over here and let's just do some rendering. So you know what, if something is loading, let's just say spinner. We're just gonna render a spinner. Apologies for that. We're just going to render our spinner. And then if we have some data, what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a list. So a list of all the things. So if we actually have data, we're going to render a UL tag, and we could also catch the error state, might as well. Let's go ahead and catch that error state over here. So let's say error. So if error, just say something went wrong. So we're gonna say something went wrong, and then over here, if we actually get back our data, let's just iterate over the let's just iterate over all of the characters. So we're gonna say character, and then what we're gonna do is for each character we want to have a li to list their location. So we're gonna say character dot location dot name. So let's go ahead and save that. And now what we can do, and this is kind of weird and wonky, but now if we go back and let's cut this guy out, let's refresh. Right now we have nothing. If we were to search this, we get a spinner, and then we get all of that data. Isn't that incredible? I just find that incredible. It's not that incredible, but whatever. I don't know what Rick's name is. Is it Rick Smith? No. I honestly don't even watch Rick and Morty. So let's see, Jeff Smith. I do not know any of these characters' names. You know what, best way to do it is, well, I built an application for this, so let's go here. Rick Shantaz. Apologies to all the Rick and Morty enthusiasts. So if I were to do this, maybe let's actually get somebody that gets us some different data, because Rick gets us the same data. Let's get, no, this Rick too. I want somebody that gives me, let's get this random girl. I don't even know who this girl is. Okay, so now let's go to our search, and then in here, you can see here that now we get her data. Isn't that terrific? And now if I were to go back to Morty, or Rick Sanchez, let's go back to Rick, and we were to search him again, you can see that that works as well. Okay, that's awesome. That is cool. In the next section, we're going to very quickly talk about mutations. but then we're done. All right, everybody, in this section, what we're going to be doing is quickly covering mutations. So mutations are ways that we can update our data or change our data in some way in GraphQL. Queries is for viewing our data, mutations is for updating our data. Unfortunately, the GraphQL, the Rick and Morty GraphQL server does not have any mutations. It's all queries. But there's this other open source, like open server that it has created that has queries as well as mutations. So you can see here we have this create product mutation. We have create order mutation. So this seems like it's dealing with food. And so what we can do here is, let's say we want to create a product. What we first have to do is specify not that we're doing a query, but we're doing a mutation. So that's the first thing that we have to do. And then we have to specify what we want to do. Well, we want to create a product. And in terms of this one over here, what we have to supply it with is a record. So we have to supply it with a record. So over here you can see what it needs. So it needs a name, it needs a supplier ID, a category ID, all these different things. So let me quickly try to zoom out of here a little bit. And so let's just do that. Let's just do that right now. So I'm assuming it's going to auto-generate the ID. So let's just give it a name, and I'm just going to give it a name of hot dog. Hot dog. We're going to give it a supplier ID of 1. I really do not know how this works. Category ID of 1. We're also going to give it a quantity of. So this is a string. We're going to give it 3. Let's see if this actually works. So if I were to execute this, it's gonna load for a little bit. Load. And oh, it's not gonna work because we also have to specify exactly the data that we want to get back. So now we're gonna say that we want to get back a record and we want to get back the name. So that's how the schema works. So over here you can see that we have created this. We don't really create it. This API doesn't actually create it, but this is how we would do something that would allow us to mutate our data. So how would we actually handle this in React? Now, unfortunately, what we cannot do is connect to our Rick and Morty GraphQL server and this GraphQL server at the same time, because it's just one URL. There's one endpoint. So let's just simulate creating this just for practice sake, but we won't be able to actually create it for real. So over here, what we're going to have to do is we're going to need to, let's just create a mutation .js component. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to create a mutation component that's going to handle this fake mutation that we want to do just for, practice sake. So let's go ahead and let's do this. And this is going to be very, very similar to how we did it inside of use lazy query. So the first thing that we want to do is specify our mutation. So let's go here, let's get GQL from this. And we're going to say import, or we're going to say const, create product. We're going to say GQL, and we're going to paste in that. And just for simplicity's sake, let's just have these two quantities over here. Let's actually have just the name as well as the quantity per unit, and we're going to make this a number. So over here, because we have some params, let's give this a name. So we're going to say mutation, we're going to say create product, and we're going to say $name is going to be of type string, as well as now we have another parameter called quantity per unit. So we can say $quantity per unit, and this is going to be of type int. And so over here, we're going to supply it over here, supply that. And then that's our mutation. So now the hook that we're going to use is the use mutation hook. And this hook is going to work very, very similarly to the way that we have the use lazy query hook. It's going to give us an array, and then we're going to say use mutation. And then we're going to supply it with the actual mutation. So this is the create product. And And then in here, we're going to supply it with the variables. And obviously the variables are going to be dynamically generated, but for now, let's just hard code them because this mutation is not even going to work. We're going to say also quantity per unit. Let's say 4. And so here, we're going to get back a function that we can call. So we can call this whatever it is that we want. We can call it create product. And then we're going to get back data. We're going to get back loading as well as error. That's pretty much it. That's really, it's very simple. Now we can have, I don't know, some sort of button inside of this. And we can have an on click. And on click, what we can do is execute this mutation. So apologies that I couldn't actually give you a real example, but you guys probably get the point. Now we can execute the mutation. We get back some data that we have specified over here. We have specified that we wanted this data back. And we also have a loading and error state. So that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I am strongly thinking about making a very thorough and intense GraphQL course in Udemy. So if I do have one, I'll link it in the description. But if you guys enjoyed this crash course, let me know because it'll definitely motivate me to do that. I'll see you guys later.